right, everybody, and we are back today talking about our second and final team in the Lone Star State and our first team in the AFC South. That team being, of course, none other than the Houston Texans. So we'll give a little bit of background with the Texans like we have with every franchise here. So the Houston Texans are actually the youngest franchise in the National Football League, just entering the league in 2002, and as you can see, really not a whole lot of postseason success. They've only made the playoffs 6 times in their franchise history, only winning 4 playoff games, never advancing past the divisional round, and of course, one of 4 teams that have not advanced to the Super Bowl. The other 3 being the Jacksonville Jaguars, who we'll be talking about in a couple videos from now, and then 2 teams we've already mentioned, the Cleveland Browns and Detroit Lions, who certainly look to be much improved this season. And I don't think Houston will be any exception. So, looking at the recent history, Houston had a very nice run here with Deshaun Watson and DeAndre Hopkins, that dynamic duo, and by the time we got to the 2019 season, things were certainly looking up. This was the year where they defeat Josh Allen and the Buffalo Bills in the wild card round in a very crazy matchup, and then go on to take a 24-0 lead against the Kansas City Chiefs in the divisional round before ultimately losing that game. But as you could see since then, the Houston Texans have failed to crack even 5 wins in each of the following 3 seasons. So in the meantime, DeAndre Hopkins, of course, gets traded to from the Houston Texans to the Arizona Cardinals, while Deshaun Watson just last season was traded to the Cleveland Browns. So Houston very much last year was fully embracing the rebuild, and we'll go ahead and look at the 2022 Houston Texans now. This was a team where this really was where they bottomed out. I don't think things will get much worse for Houston than they did this season. They really didn't have much of a direction. So what went wrong with the 2022 Texans? Well, they bring in Lovie Smith as the head coach, and no, I'm not saying that's where things went wrong. This really isn't Lovie's fault. He was their defensive coordinator in 2021, although it definitely seems like Houston's front office just sort of brought him in to be a placeholder coach for this one season intentionally, kind of just leaving him out to dry with a roster that really didn't have much talent on it at all, in hopes that they would end up with the #1 overall selection to take Bryce Young in the 2023 NFL draft. So we'll see if they ultimately get there. Moving along, they of course end up with one of the worst ranked offenses in the National Football League last year, and the defense really wasn't much better either. So very poor unit all around on both sides of the football. And if we look at their schedule briefly here, they end up tying their first game of the season against the Indianapolis Colts before only winning 2 games between their first matchup. They actually play the Colts in week 1 and week 18, first and last week of the season. And between those 2 matchups, they only win 2 games against the Jacksonville Jaguars, impressively considering Jacksonville ended up winning the AFC South and the division. But they also defeat another divisional opponent, the Tennessee Titans, before facing the Indianapolis Colts in the final week. And I will note they did nearly beat the Kansas City Chiefs here in week 15. That really would have been something. But we get to week 18 against the Indianapolis Colts, and this was really their only notable game of the season, because what was at stake here was the the Houston Texans needed to lose this game to secure the #1 overall selection, and Lovie Smith kind of smelled the writing on the wall. He's sort of learned that, yeah, it's kind of a tank job on the Houston's front office part. The front office wants the Houston Texans to get the #1 overall pick, and then they're going to fire Lovie Smith that Monday. So what does he do? He rallies the team to go out and win against the lowly Indianapolis Colts by 1 point. So when all's said and done, the Houston Texans do finish with a 3-3 record in the AFC South, despite the fact that they only had 3 wins all season. And they also had, I'm sorry, they actually didn't even go 3-3 in the division. They go 3-2-1, so technically have a winning record in their division, despite the fact that they finished with the second worst record in the National Football League. right ahead of the Chicago Bears, who, as we know, were the worst team in the league last year. So I won't waste too much more time on this 2022 Houston team. There really isn't much to talk about. Davis Mills was their quarterback and really wasn't impressive at all. He had a solid rookie campaign in 2021, but definitely regressed this past year. Certainly didn't show any improvement. Looking down at the wide receiver spot, zero wide receivers crack, or zero receivers in general crack the 700 yards mark. Jordan Akins has their most receiving touchdowns with 5, the only player who had more than 3. Though I will give a shout out to Dameon Pierce, rookie running back for the Houston Texans, who in just 13 games played nearly hit the 1,000-yard mark. So definitely a solid season for Dameon Pierce, all things considered, and look forward to seeing what he can continue to do at the highest level as his career progresses now in 2023. Then looking at the defense, really not too much to get excited about here. I mean, Jalen Petire has solid season here with playing all 17 games, 5 interceptions, 1 fumble recovery, 1 sack. And Jerry Hughes, 34-year-old defensive lineman with 9 sacks and an interception, but really not too much to write home about there. As we know, not a very impressive unit at all last season. So I will also mention before we proceed, Laramie Tunsil, the offensive tackle for the Houston Texans. Their starting left tackle was their only Pro Bowl player off of this roster. So on that note, we'll look at what Houston did this offseason to try to retool this roster, and they certainly were very active both in free agency and the draft. So first we'll look at their departures. Some of the notable players that Houston lost included safety Jonathan Owens, who leaves for, where is he at here? Leaves for the Green Bay Packers, as we just mentioned in the Green Bay video. He played 82% of snaps last year, so that gives them a bit of a void at the safety position. They also lose wide receiver Chris Moore to the Tennessee Titans. They lose two defensive ends. They lose Rasheem Green to the Chicago Bears. He played, where is he at here? He played 48% of snaps last year, and he was only age 26. Certainly a player who played a key role on that defense, at least was notable, I guess, on that defensive line. Then we also have good old Double O departing to the Cleveland Browns. I really should have looked up how to pronounce this man's name before the video, but I'm not even going to attempt to botch it. I feel like that would only bring disrespect to him. So he plays 44% of snaps last season for the Houston Texans, and he departs to the Cleveland Browns at age 28. But as we'll see, Houston's able to recover these losses pretty well. And one more player I will mention, of course, is Brandon Cooks, who got traded to the Dallas Cowboys, wide receiver, been in the NFL for a long time. Many NFL fans probably know who Brandon Cooks is already. He's played for the New Orleans Saints, the New England Patriots, the Los Angeles Rams, and more recently, of course, the Houston Texans. But he played 61% of snaps last season and definitely figures to be somebody to play a key role on the Dallas Cowboys, as we mentioned in that video. But that's really it for their departures. So they lose a couple wide receivers, a couple defensive ends, and a safety. So other than that, really not too many players who ate big minutes for, I don't know why I keep on saying 8 big minutes. This isn't basketball or hockey, but played a large percentage of snaps, played a large role on their teams. They really didn't lose many players. So looking now at the players they acquire, they bring in wide receiver Robert Woods from the Tennessee Titans, formerly of the Los Angeles Rams as well. He played 78% of snaps for the Titans last year, which didn't even feel like it, honestly. Robert Woods, definitely somebody who is at age 31, probably coming up on the end of his career, unfortunately, but they effectively switch him with Chris Moore, effectively trade those two players. And I mean, honestly, I probably do like the Houston Texans end of that deal acquiring Robert Woods, although, I mean, Chris Moore is only 1 year younger, so I would say Houston got the better end of that swap. They also bring in Denzel Perryman, linebacker who has excelled tremendously the last 2 seasons with the Las Vegas Raiders. He played 49% of snaps for them last season at age 30, so he will now age 31 this season, so he will certainly be a leader for this Houston Texans defense, and they absolutely need one. They also bring in Corey Littleton, another veteran linebacker, this time from the Carolina Panthers. Another player they bring in on defense, Sheldon Rankins, for that interior of their defensive line. Then, as I mentioned in the Dallas video, this is another effective swap, or effective trade, if you will, this time between the Dallas Cowboys and the Houston Texans. So, as we mentioned, the Houston Texans trade Brandon Cooks to the Dallas Cowboys for a late round draft pick, but they also sign in free agency from the Dallas Cowboys Noah Brown and Dalton Schultz, both of whom were very key contributors on that Dallas Cowboys offense last season. So they could certainly help offset the loss of Brandon Cooks' production on offense. Moving along, they also bring in another player who could help them out on offense, Shaq Mason from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Where's he at here? He plays 98.6% of snaps last season, so certainly could bring some stability to a Houston offensive line that, outside of Laramie Tunsil, really wasn't very impressive last season. Then we will also mention they bring in safety Jimmy Ward from the San Francisco 49ers. He'll certainly help offset the loss of Jonathan Owens to the Green Bay Packers. And then finally, I will mention they bring in Devin Singletary, the running back from the Buffalo Bills. So gives Dameon Pierce a running mate in the backfield. The two of them should form a nice tandem. If you do play fantasy football, that may be a bit of a bummer because that probably hurts Dameon Pierce's stock just a little bit, but in terms of the Houston Texans offense, I certainly think that will be of benefit to them. Now, before we look at the Houston Texans 2023 draft, I did also want to mention former Houston Texans linebacker Demeco Ryans is going to be the head coach for the Texans in 2023. Probably should have mentioned that earlier. Of course, Lovie Smith no longer the head coach. As I said earlier, last year was his first and last season as Houston Texans head coach. Sort of a lame duck head coach right from the jump. Really set up for failure, unfortunately. But Demeco Ryans is another defensive-minded head coach, so certainly intrigued to see what he's able to do with this Houston Texans defensive unit. So now looking at this 2023 draft, and Houston certainly was one of the more active teams at the 2023 draft. Now heading into this draft, they possessed, of course, the number 2 overall selection because of their 13 and 3-1 record last season, although they did also possess the number 12 overall pick by way of the Cleveland Browns when they traded Deshaun Watson to the Browns last year. So they have Cleveland's first round pick. Well, originally had Cleveland's first round pick in 2022, also had it here in 2023, and they will also have it, as we'll see in a little bit, in 2024. But Houston ends up trading up from the 2023 from the Browns 2023 pick. They move up from number 12 all the way up to number 3. So Houston ends up selecting second overall and third overall, back-to-back picks when all is said and done. Truly an unprecedented move in NFL history, I would say. I don't know if I can ever recall a time where one team possessed 2 top 3 picks in the same draft. So incredible stuff there by Houston. I do remember the Cleveland Browns had the first and fourth overall selection back in 2018, but that's really the closest thing I can remember to something like this. But that being said, with this Will Anderson trade, or the pick up for the trade to move up for the number 3 overall selection, the Houston Texans give up their own 2024 first round pick. So they do still have Cleveland's first round pick, as we'll see in a little bit, but they do not have their own first round pick in 2024, which to me certainly says that Houston is all in on just trying to improve this year. They want to put the best product on the field possible, and they want to try to win football games, most importantly. It's not going to be like last season where they were doing this tank job to try to get Bryce Young, whether they'll admit it or not. Houston really doesn't have much incentive to have another poor season this year because they don't have their first round pick, so definitely excited to see what they're capable of this year. So now looking at the actual picks here, they do select CJ Stroud, quarterback, with the second overall pick out of Ohio State. And as I mentioned, they select Will Anderson out of Alabama with the third overall pick. And he's listed as a linebacker, but he figures to be more of a defensive end in their 4-3 scheme on defense. Some of the other notable players they select here: Juice Scruggs, the offensive lineman out of Penn State; Nathaniel Dell, or Tank Dell if you will, out of the University of Houston, so he doesn't have to go far at all. And then Henry Toto from the University of Alabama as well, defensive teammate of Will Anderson. So certainly some talent coming into this Houston Texans roster this season, both on the offense and defensive side of the ball in free agency and in the draft. And I'm certainly interested to see how they put it all together. So with that being said, let's look at Houston Texans 2023 unofficial depth chart as of August 15th, excuse me. So there's really not too many camp battles going on here, at least not as many as I anticipated for a team on that is emerging from a rebuild like the Houston Texans. We'll start with the quarterback position. And CJ Stroud, the second overall pick this year, is projected to be the starter. Although initially, when going into this video, I wasn't entirely sold on the idea of starting CJ Stroud right away. Just because, one, Ohio State quarterbacks don't have a solid track record in the NFL, and I know that really shouldn't matter whether the Houston Texans start CJ Stroud right away, but I also think back to a lot of quarterbacks who get thrust into the fire a little bit too soon. I mean, if we want to stick with the Houston Texans, we could look at their very first season with David Carr. I believe CJ Stroud will be, I'm not going to say the first rookie to start for the Houston Texans because Davis Mills did in 2021, but I suppose the first round quarterback to start for the Houston Texans since David Carr back in 2022. And he was thrown into, I mean, it was a brand new franchise. He really just got eaten alive back there because he had no support at all on that offense. And I feared that something would be very similar with CJ Stroud here, but as we'll see in a second, the rest of this offense isn't nearly as poor as I thought it might have been. So, with that being said, CJ Stroud certainly figures to be the starter, Davis Mills backing him up, and then they even bring in the veteran Case Keenum to be the third stringer, former University of Houston player himself, so definitely an interesting connection there. Looking at the running back position, as we mentioned in the free agency segment, Dameon Pierce and Devin Singletary are both figuring to be the tandem, the two-headed monster, if you will, in this backfield. Maybe some of these other players can figure to get some snaps at some point this season, but I assume as long as these two guys are healthy, they will get the large percentage of the carries. And it seems that Houston is of the same mindset with, at this point in training camp, they only have 5 running backs on the roster, whereas a lot of teams have several more just because why not to have the bodies at camp. But Houston only has 5 running backs at the time, which certainly signals to me they have a lot of confidence in the duo of Pierce and Singletary. Looking at the tight end spot now, this should be Dalton Schultz's job to lose. Don't really see why he wouldn't get the vast majority of the reps at tight end. He's going to be a nice safety blanket for CJ Stroud, much like he has been for Dak Prescott in Dallas. Then we have a couple young players backing him up here. Tegan, geez, these guys with their last names. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. Tegan, the second year player in the 5th round last season. And then Brevin Jordan, the 3rd-year player, also holding up the depth chart there with the 3rd spot. So certainly looks like Houston has a lot of tight ends on the roster, so there could certainly be a competition for potentially that 2nd and 3rd spot. But as of right now, this is Dalton Schultz's job. Not really too much debate there. There will be some competition going on at the wide receiver spot, though. Certainly our first notable competition so far. And this is because Houston really doesn't have a consensus number 1 receiver. They have a bunch of players here who are certainly talented and will certainly be worthy of seeing some playing time this season, but it seems like they're really just trying to determine what order these guys should be playing in. And you expect that of a rebuilding team. We look at some teams who are closer to competing now, like the Cincinnati Bengals. In that video, we discussed how their 1, 2, and 3 are pretty much locked in, but there's a wide open competition for that number 4 receiver position. And that seems to be the case with a lot of contending teams. But for a rebuilding team like Houston, they really have 6 receivers they have faith in here. And they really just need to figure out the order of them. So just to go through the quick rundown, we have the 3rd-year player, Nico Collins, 2nd-year player, John Mitchie, of course the free agent acquisition, Robert Woods, and then the rookies, Xavier Hutchinson in the 6th round, Tank Dell in the 3rd round. Tank Dell could really be an explosive player for them, and I certainly would not be surprised if by the end of the season he emerges as their number 1 option on offense. And then you also have Noah Brown, the other player they brought in from Dallas. So really not a bad option at all out of those six. And that is a good thing for the Houston Texans. Competition brings out the best in everybody, of course, and that gives a large quantity of options for CJ Stroud to build some rapport with and really develop some chemistry on the offensive side of the ball. So, with that being said, I'm really not overly disappointed, I guess, with the Houston Texans skill position players. I was expecting it to be a little bit more rough than that, but we can go over the offensive line real quick. But so far, so good for this Houston Texans offense, honestly, considering they were a 3-win team last season, of course. Laramie Tunsil at the left tackle position, though, is definitely the best player on this offense by far. And as we mentioned, he was their only Pro Bowl selection last season. They just signed him to a large contract extension, rightfully deserved. He played every single snap on offense for them last season. Though they do bring in George Fant to help him out, potentially could step in for Titus Howard, the right tackle as well. So looking at the guard position now, they do have Kenyon Green, their first round pick from last year, playing alongside Shaq Mason, who they acquired from the Tampa Bay Bucks. And then finally, I will mention at the center position, Juice Scruggs is currently seizing this role at training camp. There was an injury to, I forget who their original starter was, but he was injured. It might be DJ Skyfe here. I forget exactly who it was, or maybe Scott Quisenberry. I know they did bring in Greg Little as well to help out at the tackle position, but he is also on IR. But all that seems irrelevant so far at Texans camp because Juice Scruggs has really seized this role. He has been impressing the Texans staff thus far, and that is only a good thing. If you have a rookie center who could step in and learn on the job this year and potentially develop over the next few seasons, this could really form into a solid offensive line. It really has the makings of a solid offensive line here. So as of right now, this is certainly a below average unit as a whole in the National Football League, but would not be surprised if this offensive line ends up overachieving this year, at least compared to what expectations are for them. So with that being said, the Houston Texans offense as a whole, really, I wouldn't say I'm overly impressed with it, but I'm certainly not disappointed with the Houston Texans offense. I thought this was going to be another instance of a rookie quarterback just getting thrown into the fire with really not much around him, but seems like with their offseason tweaks, Houston's really done a good job of retooling this offense to really put CJ Stroud in the best possible position they could have, all things considered, while still keeping an eye on this defense because, of course, they could have used that second first-round pick to double down on the offense, but I guess this is a good segue into the defense now. So looking at the defense, they end up getting their franchise player on defense as well in Will Anderson with the third overall selection. And really not too much else of note on the defensive line. They bring in Sheldon Rankins, and they have Jonathan Greenard and Malik Collins rounding out the defensive line, but they also have Hassan Ridgeway as a potential veteran backup. Really not an overly exceptional unit by any means. I would say they are certainly, again, like their offensive line, going to be a below average unit in the National Football League this year. But this year for Houston's all about laying the foundation, I feel like. They're really just trying to start the next chapter of their franchise. And by selecting CJ Stroud and Will Anderson, I said it at the draft. I know a lot of people are of the same mindset. Houston got their building block on offense and their building block on defense. Their franchise player on offense and their franchise player on defense. So when you want to build a strong contending team in the National Football League, it starts with star players. You need to have a franchise player that you could build this thing around because now it's easy to find players to help fill in these gaps, to help support these guys. But once you have that big name in there, that guy you know is going to be the difference maker, finding support pieces around him is just secondary, and even an average front office should be able to do that at least reasonably well. So moving on to the linebacker position, with that being said, they do bring in Denzel Perryman from the Vegas Raiders, as we mentioned, and Corey Littleton from the Carolina Panthers, but they also have Christian Harris, the second-year player, Blake Cashman projected to start as well, but Henry Toto has really showed in training camp he means business, and he's somebody who is certainly going to be looking for a starting position. As of right now, it doesn't seem like he's going to be getting a starting role at training camp, although would not be surprised if by the end of the season if Henry Toto is somebody who is making plays on this Houston Texans defense and somebody that could even be slotted in as a starter by the end of the 2023 season, looking ahead to the 2024 season. Could be a nice little project for them on defense. Then rounding it out, we'll look at the secondary, which certainly does leave something to be desired as well. Houston didn't put a ton of resources into this defense over the course of the offseason. They do bring in Jimmy Ward to help keep that safety position afloat. He'll play alongside Jalen Petire, the second-year player, but certainly some concern with Devin Stingley Jr. This was, if we recall, the third overall selection in the entire 2022 NFL draft. Now, he hasn't been a bad player. I'm not going to sit here and say that Devin Stingley Jr. is a bust, like, say, a Jeff Okudah, who was another corner selected third overall very recently, but this was a player selected in between Aiden Hutchinson and Sauce Gardner, so certainly surrounded by two players that absolutely proved they are future NFL stars last season. While I wouldn't be overly concerned if I were a Houston Texans fan with Derek Stingley Jr., I would like to see a little bit more from him this year, but being drafted that high, the expectation is he's going to be a number one lockdown corner, and he just simply wasn't that last season. So now with Will Anderson perhaps giving them a little bit more of a pass rush than they had last season, maybe it could help him step up, but certainly keep an eye on Derek Stingley. Starting opposite of him is slated to be Steven Nelson, and then Desmond King at the nickel cornerback position. Really not too much competition going on here as well. And notice this depth chart is really thin on the back end of this defense. Really not a lot of players in terms of just sheer quantity on this defense, which I find interesting. But with that being said, we could look at Houston's 2023 schedule, how this all comes together for them. Now, looking at their schedule, I don't believe Houston's going to be competing for the AFC playoff picture. Honestly, as loaded as the AFC is, I believe Houston is one of three teams that won't be in the hunt at all for the AFC playoff picture. And the other two teams being actually the team we'll talk about next, the Indianapolis Colts, as well as the Vegas Raiders. I don't believe the three of those teams have much of a shot to make the AFC playoffs. Would certainly be pleasantly surprised if they were able to make a push, but I think those three teams are certainly in more of a rebuilding phase. The Colts and Texans more so emerging from a rebuild, and I think Vegas is entering one right now. So looking at this Houston Texans schedule, they start off with a matchup against the Baltimore Ravens, which really isn't going to be a great way to kick off the CJ Stroud, Will Anderson era, but Baltimore's a good team. They're a great team, as I should say, much better than Houston at this stage of the game, and that should be a loss for the Houston Texans. Maybe the Houston Texans could learn a thing or two by seeing a team like the Ravens, but certainly think that they'll be starting off 0-1. Then they'll come back home against the Indianapolis Colts, and this honestly could be a win for the Houston Texans. I do have Indianapolis projected to win this matchup as of right now. I think Indianapolis has a little bit more talent all around on their roster than the Texans at this point. Houston's certainly a team that's more on the up and up, but Indianapolis, I think, has more established talent already on their roster, and for a Week 2 matchup, the Colts might just take advantage of that. Although if they are starting a rookie quarterback themselves in Anthony Richardson, this game's absolutely a coin flip. The Texans did beat the Colts last year and tie with them, so in their two matchups, they did not lose one of them, so would not be surprised if the Texans start off 1-1. But then they play the Jacksonville Jaguars in Week 3 before facing the Pittsburgh Steelers in Week 4. That should be two losses. Jacksonville and Pittsburgh both figure to be in the playoff picture, so nothing against Houston. They probably drop those games. Atlanta, this could be another winnable game. Same with the New Orleans Saints, which I do have the Texans winning, but we'll give them a split here. I don't think they win both of them. You could mix and match these games in whatever order you like, but I just gave the victories to the home teams. Then they have the bye, and emerging from the bye, they go up against the number 1 overall selection, the Carolina Panthers, coached by Bryce Young, coached by Frank Reich. And this could be a pretty good game. This will certainly be a fun game. It always is when you have two rookie quarterbacks going up against each other, but I give the nod to the Carolina Panthers as of right now. I think they just have a little bit more going for their roster right now, all around. I like them in the trenches a little bit better on both sides of the football. I like their secondary better than the Houston Texans. And even their weapons on offense might be just a little bit better. So, that being said, I wouldn't be shocked if Houston won this game. But then going up against the Tampa Bay Bucks and the Cincinnati Bengals, I think both of those games will be losses. Again, just an instance of the Texans being outmatched, nothing really against them. But they will get a win over the Arizona Cardinals. Pretty much anybody the Cardinals are playing this year should get a win against them, but that'll help give them some mojo in the second half of the season here. But the schedule really starts to get difficult after this. They play the Jaguars, Broncos, Jets, Titans, Browns, and Titans again. So that is a brutal 6-week stretch there throughout November into late December. Maybe the Texans could pick off one of these games in here, but these are all teams that figure to be in the mix for the playoffs, whereas by this point Houston should sort of be facing the music that they're out of the playoffs. Maybe they could rally and play spoiler to one of these teams, but all of these teams are going to be bringing their A game because they're going to need these wins to make the playoffs. But do throw the Houston Texans a bone here in the final week of the season against the Indianapolis Colts. Think that especially after playing all of these tough competitive games over the last 6 weeks, getting a matchup against a team like the Colts should be beneficial for the Texans, and they end up ending the season on a high note, much like they did last season with a win over the Colts, exactly like last season. So when all said and done, the Texans finished with a 3-14 record. Though we could give them a couple more of these games hypothetically. Wouldn't be surprised if they ended up sweeping the Colts. Wouldn't be surprised if they beat the Atlanta Falcons. Wouldn't be surprised if they beat the Carolina Panthers. And maybe they could upset one of these games against, say, the Tennessee Titans. So who knows? I mean, that gives them 7 wins, which I think is their absolute ceiling this season. But if CJ Stroud has an incredible rookie season, Will Anderson has an incredible rookie season, that would certainly be very impressive. And if the Houston Texans did want to be talked about as a team potentially going on making a playoff push in 2024, that's the kind of season they'll need to have. They'll need to be a team that wins, maybe not necessarily 7-10. Certainly, if they did win 7 games, they would be mentioned as an up and coming team that could potentially make the playoffs next season. But even if they win 6 games, they go 6-11. That's a good step in the right direction for them. 3-14 is technically a step back from last season, which would honestly surprise me a little bit. I think they probably win another game in here somewhere. I'm just not quite sure where that is at this point. And I do need to see it from CJ Stroud still. I think out of the 3 rookie quarterbacks, he's probably the one I have the least amount of confidence in. Although I do have my fair share of question marks with Anthony Richardson as well. Though Anthony Richardson is very young, so I don't think it'll really be too much of a knock on him if he has a tough rookie season. But for the Houston Texans, this is a team that doesn't have their first round pick next season, which honestly we could look at that first before we even look at their salary cap. So Houston doesn't have their first round pick next year. They owe it to the Arizona Cardinals. They do possess the Cleveland Browns first round pick, though I imagine that will be much later than the Houston Texans first round pick. Then they have their own second round pick. They traded their third round pick again to the Arizona Cardinals, but they do have the Philadelphia Eagles third round pick. Again, though, the Philadelphia Eagles third round pick should be much later than the Houston Texans. They do have 2 fourth round selections, 1 fifth, 1 sixth, because they owe 1 to the Atlanta Falcons. And then going on to the 7th round, they have 3 picks. So really not too much doing for future draft capital. They will have picks in every round, but in the first and third round, these picks could be much later than what their record would indicate. So certainly important that Houston does have a step in the right direction this year. 3-14 would be considered sort of a failure for them, but this AFC really is just so tough. They have this really brutal stretch of games late in the season, so they're going to need to get some wins early on. And I guess we'll see. That's why we play the games, right? So before we wrap this up, we can look briefly at the Houston Texans salary cap situation going forward, which there really isn't too much to say here because the Houston Texans are a team that isn't emerging from a rebuild. They don't have a lot of big money committed to players right now. They do have $223 million on the cap this year, but a lot of that is because they have over $20 million of that in dead money for Brandon Cooks. But as you see beyond this season, it really opens up for them. And of course, CJ Stroud on his rookie deal, not a lot of money tied up at the quarterback position in general. At the running back spot, Devin Singletary on a 1-year deal, Dameon Pierce still another 3 years on his rookie deal. Wide receiver, you have Robert Woods on a 2-year deal, Noah Brown in a contract year. Then really not a lot of money committed here otherwise. Nobody else really making more than 2 or 3 million. Tight end Dalton Schultz just on a 1-year flyer, just under $3 million. The offensive line, Laramie Tunsil, Titus Howard, and Shaq Mason all locked up, but you honestly want to see that with a rookie quarterback. You want stability on that offensive line, absolutely. Then Kenyon Green, 3 more years, plus a potential 4th-year club option. And then Juice Scruggs on a 4-year rookie deal. So all 5 of their offensive linemen that are slated to start right now signed for the next 4 seasons. Certainly a good sign. Looking at the defensive line, really not a lot of money tied up here either. This is really just pretty uneventful all around. Malik Collins, the only real notable contract. At the linebacker position, Will Levis, we'll mention him with the Titans. Will Anderson, more of a defensive lineman, more of an edge rusher, but listed as an outside linebacker here. 4 years, 5th-year option. We know the drill with these first-round picks. Pretty much every other notable contract in a contract year this season, including the veterans Perryman and Littleton. Do have Henry Toto signed for the next 4 seasons, though, so if he could develop, certainly would be a nice asset for them. Then Derek Stingley Jr. in the secondary. Really the only notable player signed beyond the season besides Jimmy Ward, who signed for just this season and the following season. So certainly will be interesting to keep an eye on Derek Stingley. As I mentioned, if he doesn't improve over the next couple seasons, they might not accept this 2026 club option. So that could be potentially worth keeping an eye on, but all in all, really not too much doing with the Houston Texans in terms of the cap. They do have a lot of flexibility. And that being said, I think this is a good place to wrap things up. Love to hear from any Texans fans down below how you think the team's going to do this year. I know last year was certainly a rough year, but I do think last year was the worst of it. I know I do have the record technically worse than last season, but this AFC really is just so brutal. Love to hear though how many wins you think they'll get this season. What do you think about that draft? Are you feeling high about CJ Stroud and Will Anderson? Honestly, I might even be a little bit bigger of a fan of the Will Anderson pick, even though he was 1 selection later. So let me know down below. Love to hear from you guys and look forward to talking to you next time about another AFC South team, the Indianapolis Colts. And that's all I got. Have a nice day, everybody.